2021 that Lego is planning to build a 1 billion mega factory in Bình Dương province in southern Vietnam. However, as of today, my understanding is that it has yet to secure the construction permit because the Vietnam-Singapore Industrial Park, where the factory will be based, has not been able to obtain the land title for the 44-hectare land plot. This is because local government officials concerned about the anti-corruption campaign and other issues have not been able to determine the land rental rate for the project yet. This is just one of the examples showing how Vietnam has not been able to achieve the level of economic success often touted or expected, sometimes due to its self-inflicted problems. So this webinar today aims to look into this issue, trying to examine some of the factors that have held back Vietnam's economic potential. It also discusses Vietnam's developmental path and its origins, thereby providing insights into its economic patterns and vulnerabilities. The webinar will also look into the party's firm control of the economy and society, delving into the historical, institutional, and political elements that have contributed to the current dilemmas facing the country. Sharing these insights with us today are two distinguished speakers, Professor Tương Vu and Dr. Như Trương. Professor Tương Vu is head of the Political Science Department of the University of Oregon. He previously held visiting appointments at Princeton University and the National University of Singapore, and used to serve as an editor of the Journal of Vietnamese Studies. Professor Tương is the author of or editor of 7 books. He has also published 30 peer-reviewed articles on the politics of nationalism, revolution, and state building in East and Southeast Asia. Currently, he also serving as the founding director of the U.S.-Vietnam Research Center at the University of Oregon. The second speaker is Dr. Như Trương, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and Public Affairs at Denison University in the United States. She is also a Mansfield Luz Asia Scholars Network Fellow, a Rosenberg Institute Scholar, and a Center for Khmer Studies Senior Research Fellow. Dr. Ny's research is concerned with the repressive responsiveness of autocracies and democracies, rural political economy, social movements, and state formation in Northeast and Southeast Asia. Her work has appeared in the Journal of East Asian Studies, Problems of Post-Communism, edited books, and different policy studies. Once again, a big thanks to you both, Anh Tương and chị Như, for joining us today, especially given that it's quite late now in the US. Our webinar will last about 1 hour and 15 minutes. We will first listen to Professor Tương, who will talk about Vietnam's economic development path, and then to Dr. Như, who will talk more about its political implications. After that, we will have about 30 to 40 minutes for the Q&A session. Now, without further ado, may I invite Professor Tương to start his presentation first. Anh Tương, the virtual floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Trying to figure out how to share my screen here. Thanks, Yep, for that great introduction, and thanks everyone for attending. It's an honor for me to be here today.
Yes, the slide is on. Yeah, please.
Okay, can you see the slide?
Yes, we have.
Yeah. So I will talk about capitalism, development, and the party state in Vietnam. And the talk is based in part on our newly published edited volume titled "The Dragon's Underbelly: Dynamics and Dilemmas in Vietnam's Economy and Politics," co-edited by Dr. Như Trương and myself. And I'm very grateful to our team of contributors, and I hope many of them will be with us today in the audience. So without further ado, let me start with the most recent development in Vietnam, in Vietnamese politics that surprised many of us. Just, before Tet, maybe a week or two, we saw the departure, the removal, or resignation, whatever you call it, of 2 deputy prime ministers Phạm Bình Minh and Vũ Đức Đam, and then later on, just a week later, State President Nguyễn Xuân Phúc. And these leaders were considered the technocrats in the government, and many foreign observers are very concerned about their removal. And the timing of the removal too is quite interesting. And the removal or resignation is believed, or I mean, at least, officially is due to their connection to the grand extortion schemes. Two of them actually. One was the rescue flight scam that involved 5 ministries, Foreign Affairs, Public Security, Health, Prime Minister Office, Transportation, one party central commission, 2 provinces. As you see in the infographics provided by Vietnam Express, there were nearly 2,000 flights to rescue, so-called rescue Vietnamese citizens abroad during the time when Vietnam did not allow outsiders coming in from the country during the COVID period. And the highest official who has been arrested is the Deputy Minister of the Foreign Affairs. The second scam was the test kits involving an entrepreneur, a private entrepreneur who simply imported cheap test kits from China and marketed as their great innovation that would save Vietnam from COVID pandemic. And the scam involved 3 ministries and 12 provinces. So the scam involved the government forcing millions of citizens taking COVID tests, some like every day, just to use the products of this company, so that the owners could make money. But there are many puzzles involving these 2 scams. First, the scam did not involve large amounts of extortion money. In the test kits case, it was about $52 million, and it was much less in the rescue flights. So it's nothing compared to the corruption case a few years ago involving Vinashin, which cost the Vietnamese government $1 billion, for example. But one is baffled at the scale of the scandal, the scale of the corruption that reached probably the state president, which is why he resigned, and spreading to so many provinces. And it involved not just politicians, but also professionals, like respected people with, in the professions that such as ambassadors, professors, medical doctors. And it was a big moral disgrace on the national scale. It was a lot more than legal violations, since these people, they were taking advantage of sick people, a country under threat of the pandemic, and Vietnamese citizens living abroad. So it was not simply just trying to make some money and pocket some money from the government, stealing some money from the government. This is kind of extorting money from the poor, the sick, the vulnerable people. And another puzzle is that there has been few mass protests, and the scam took place 4 or 5 years after Mr. Trump, the General Secretary of the party anti-corruption campaign, which has made a great reputation abroad, but seem not to prevent this kind of corruption to take place. And then the scams were exposed only when the police wanted to investigate. It was very clear, like the import of Chinese products to be sold. The entrepreneur did not even have a factory. The prices were very high. The rescue flights, charge the passengers a lot of money. That happened for a year or two, like in plain sight, under the sun. But they were exposed only when the police wanted to investigate, prompting many to think of them as factional struggle. But now, after looking at this new development, let us take a step back to ask how we got here. If we look at Vietnam general economic picture, the left panel shows Vietnam had decent economic growth rates, second in the region after China, and higher than the neighbors. But the right panel shows that Vietnam, the per capita GDP is still pretty low relative to other countries. So that's kind of the just a one line from the general picture that Vietnam has had good growth rates, but still lagging behind regionally. These tables shows that Vietnam is has a widely open economy. The top panel shows that the ratio of external trade to GDP is very high, only lower than Singapore. And the ratio of FDI to GDP is also only lower than Singapore. So Vietnam has a widely open economy, but then the lower table to your left showing that Vietnam was simply assembling products made in South Korea and China to re-export to the EU and the US. So Vietnam occupies low position on global value chain. And the right table shows that Vietnam's productivity, in terms of gross value added per worker in industry, is very low in the region. It's surprisingly like 3 times lower than the Philippines and 4 times lower than Thailand, and lower than the average lower middle income of the group of countries that Vietnam belong. So these are the serious problems in Vietnamese economy that many analysts have pointed out. There's nothing new in these. And this table shows, the capital flows into Vietnam. Sorry, the data are not current, but you could see that the 3 main sources of capital inflows into Vietnam were foreign direct investment, official development aid, and remittances. So remittances, since 2000 or so, have played a big role in Vietnamese development. In some years, kind of overtaking foreign aid. These table shows, the various industrial sectors in Vietnamese economy. The top panel shows that the state sector accounts for about 30% of the economy. The private sector about 40%, a bit above 40%, and the foreign directed invested sector accounted for about 20% of the economy. And in comparison, the state sector, as you see, in red color in the lower table, is highly inefficient in terms of the rate of return on assets, is below average, and only like 3 times less than the rate for foreign-owned enterprises. Rate of return on equity is a little bit better for the state-owned enterprises, but still much lower than the foreign sector. So the state-owned firms, there are exceptions, but then in general, this is like on average, they perform a lot less well than the foreign, and even for the private owned firms. So the tables show that, show what causes economic growth in Vietnam. And our chapter in the book also provides more data on the causes of economic growth in Vietnam since market reform in the late 80s. So the causes include, earlier investment in education and health, availability of vast human and material resources, release of repressed capacity under socialism. Under socialism, there were no official market, no legal markets for labor, for goods, for services. So they were generally highly undervalued and underused, underemployed. So when the government lifted the restrictions on markets, there was a lot of repressed capacity that helped the economy to grow very fast in the first decade or so, or two. One must acknowledge, the attempts or the efforts of the Vietnamese government to implement policy and institutional reforms, such as the collectivization, such as, the land and company laws, foreign trade regimes, and so on. The capital inflows already mentioned, and finally, the favorable geographical location and cultural affinity that Vietnam is located. So let's turn to the next question, which is what has been Vietnam's development strategy and what political purposes does the strategy serve? So I'm not an economist, right? I'm a political scientist. So I study the economy to understand the politics of Vietnam. So in terms of Vietnam's economic development strategy, when we go back to the 1980s, we found out that the motives of market reform back then and still until now, even though less important, so included the fear of collapse, after following the collapse of the Eastern European communism, communist and the Soviet Union countries, the fear of Vietnam, sharing the same fate with those communist countries, and also the need to preserve the Communist Party rule. So Vietnamese leaders, especially the first generation, actually had developmental aspirations. They wanted Vietnam to be like South Korea, or like, the Soviet Union, or like all the developed countries in Europe. But then these aspirations, I argue, have been held back by the politics, by the fear of collapse and the need to preserve Communist Party rule. So the scope of đổi mới in Vietnam is limited to the extent that it would not threaten Communist Party rule in Vietnamese, changing the color of the country's đổi mới, but not đổi màu. So if you read Vietnamese presses, you will see this slogan many times. So comparing, but when we compare South Korean to Vietnamese industrialization, South Korea relied on autonomous and dynamic domestic private sector, whereas in Vietnam, that sector is kept under tight control. And the government favor the state-owned sector and provide access to land, capital, and other things to the state-owned sectors, but ignore or does not help, if not even discriminate against the private sector. And the second aspect of South Korean industrialization that Vietnam lacked is the bureaucracy. In South Korea, it's generally meritocratic or technocratic bureaucracy compared to Vietnam, where to get a leadership position, you need to be a party member. So the bureaucracy in Vietnam is greatly compromised by that political requirement. And finally, South Korea has adopted a capitalist ideology in its domestic and foreign policy, whereas Vietnam, it's generally socialist ideology, meaning it prefers being close to China and not being too close to the US, for example, but there are other examples. So the next question that I want to talk about is what is the nature of capitalism and the state in Vietnam, based on Vietnam's economic development strategy, based on the pattern of Vietnamese economic growth. What is the what can we say about the nature of capitalism and the state in Vietnam, and what concepts that best capture the reality that we see in Vietnam? So one concept may be red crony capitalism, meaning a system of an economic system in which we can observe that close family ties and political connections between Communist Party members and business owners. Like in South Korea, many scholars consider it to have, before the Asian financial crisis, South Korea, Indonesia had crony capitalism, but in Vietnam it's red crony capitalism because of the role of the Communist Party in this. As you see in the images, Deputy Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc, when he was still, back a decade ago, he was very close to many businesses, and the lower panel shows the image of Nguyễn Thị Thanh Nhàn, who is now on the run, on the warrant, and rumored to have a close relationship with the current Prime Minister Phạm Minh Chính. An alternative concept is a predatory party state. According to Peter Evans in his book, comparing states in industrial transformation in 4 countries, he contrasts South Korea, as a developmental state, to Zaire, for example, in Africa, as a predatory state, which he defines as a state that ruthlessly extracts resources from society and provides little in return. And thinking of going back to the recent scams, the rescue flights and the test kits, like the state officials were preying on vulnerable subjects, on vulnerable citizens, those who wanted to go home, maybe to see their dying parents or their sick relatives, or those who, the poor people, the poor working people who were forced to take expensive tests for COVID. Like those scams really speak to this image of a predatory state that take advantage of, vulnerable and weak people to eat them up, right? Basically, essentially. But we can also think of the party state as a crime syndicate. So Charles Tilly, in his provocative article in this book, Bringing the State Back in 1985, published 1985, he studies state formation, war making, and state making, and during state formation, and argue that the process is similar to like organized crime. And he writes that if protection rackets represent organized crime at its smoothest, then war making and state making quintessential protection rackets with the advantage of legitimacy qualify as our largest examples of organized crime. Without branding or generals and statements as murderers or thieves, I want to urge the value of that analogy. So, protection rackets refer to, like strong men, in the history of those countries who were experts in violence and, offer protection to whoever vulnerable to gain access to to taxes and rents. So the panels to the right show like all the corrupt officials who had been prosecuted in the last 10 years or so. Many of them very high-ranking, one Politburo member, several general directors of banks, several ministers, and police generals, and so on. So even though, like we may argue that, okay, the recent scams are not that huge, and the party, actually persecuted a lot of them. But maybe in the future, it seems that, the analogy seems to point to the future of the party state if this is not, stopped, if this trend is not stopped. And finally, is the concept of dependency development, borrowed from studies of Latin American political economy. Back in the 1980s, as Cardoso and Falato argued, the nature of the dominant state relationship develops through the strengthening of the alliance between the local entrepreneurial sector associated with the multinational foreign enterprises and the state productive sector. So pay attention, especially to the relationship between the state, the local, the foreign enterprises, and the state productive sector, because in Vietnam, we don't have the local entrepreneurial sector under the wing of the state. So what if we ask, what is the party state in Vietnam an Asian foreign capital? Is it heading there? How much can we say about this? I just try to be funny. SRV, which stands for the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, we may, change it to the Samsung Republic of Vietnam. Samsung products now account for about 10% of Vietnamese exports or so. I don't have the most recent data, but Samsung just represent, nothing bad about Samsung. I have Samsung fridge at home, but just gotta refer to the foreign sector in Vietnam. That sort of dominant, play a big role in Vietnamese economy right now, that collects profits from resources, not just material but human resources, the workers, and pay rent to the state in return for protection. And the state uses rents to give patronage to the state-owned enterprises, which also receive rents from the resources. So that's what I would call Samsung socialism, right? Vietnam. So Vietnam's proud of socialism, but maybe it's maybe we can think of it as just simply Samsung socialism. And if we can understand this better if we compare it to what I call a liberal leaning developmentalism. So South Korea, many scholars have pointed out that it has a developmental state, but it also, we need to, when we compare to Vietnam, we need to acknowledge its liberal leaning, liberal tendencies. By liberal, I mean state coordinated market economy. So it has a market economy, not like Vietnam. It has no or few state-owned enterprises. It acknowledges full private property rights. It has multi-party competitive elections, and at some levels, press, academic, intellectual freedoms. Compared to Vietnam, which doesn't have those things. And in terms of developmentalism, it has capitalist ideology, as I said, meritocratic or technocratic bureaucracy, and an autonomous national capitalist class. So what I think Vietnam can do to become, the next South Korea, to become a Reagan, is to abandon this Samsung socialism, privatize its SOEs, create a professional state bureaucracy, instead of just the party just get out of the bureaucracy and let the bureaucracy functions, as a barbarian bureaucracy, and finally liberalize society, economy, and perhaps eventually politics. We don't have to think of politics right now if the party is concerned about losing power, but at least it needs to make the above changes for it to have a strong economy. Thank you very much for this, for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Anh Thương, for your very comprehensive and insightful analysis. Some of your remarks are very straightforward and thought-provoking, and I expect to receive feedback from the audience later on some of the points you made. But before we start that discussion, let's listen to the presentation by Dr. New first. Dr. New, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I also want to echo the sincere thanks to you, HIP, and ICs and your team for organizing and for hosting us and giving us this opportunity. And also, I also have a Samsung TV, and I'm also using a Samsung laptop. So Tung has, in his presentation, has nicely laid out, incisively analyzed, identified certain pathologies and vulnerabilities that need to be recognized, right? And that need to be rectified in order for Vietnam to truly realize its full potential. So in my presentation, the question that I'm going to address next is, how has this economic growth in turn affected Vietnam politics, particularly state society dynamics, as well as the Vietnamese Communist Party social control? And so I'm going to take a second to just share my slide with you. Hopefully it will all go smoothly. Can you? Let me try again. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great, great. Trying to move the slide here. Okay, perfect. So as I mentioned, the question that I'm looking at is, how has economic growth affected Vietnamese politics and society? And the central question, first and foremost, I'm going to trace three important developments by applying Samuel Huntington gap hypothesis framework, right? Specifically, that the process of economic growth and the change associated with this process in Vietnam has fundamentally shaped state society dynamics in the following ways. First, it underscored that when there's a gap between social mobilization and economic development, this can lead to social frustration. And so economic growth can increase material well-being at one rate, but social frustration can increase at a faster rate. Second, increased social frustration without sufficient mobility opportunities can effectively galvanize individuals and groups into politics, whereby groups increasingly participate in the realm of politics. So you can see increased political participation. Third and lastly, the gap between political participation and political institutionalization, that is when you don't have sufficient political institution that either fail to accommodate societal demands, fail to allow for the political participation. In this case, when there's such a gap, the palpable consequence of this is political instability. And so I'm going to trace these three processes in Vietnam over time, and the implications that come out of this. First is that it is imperative, therefore, for Vietnam's political development to not lag behind the country's rapid social and economic change. Second, the implication is also, rather than seeking to repress social frustration and increase political participation by force through sheer coercion or legal means, it is imperative that Vietnam's political institutions are more systematically responsive to the demands and wishes of citizens. And lastly, the last implication for Vietnam is that, up to date, when you look at Vietnam in comparative perspective with other single party regimes or other dominant party regimes like China and Cambodia, countries that I've also looked at more closely, Vietnam has distinguished itself in its lesser degree of repression, I would argue. And therefore, it is imperative that Vietnam does not regress, meaning that Vietnam does not regress in turn toward the adoption of increased institutionalization of repression and be the same and adopt China, for instance, as the model to follow, to emulate. So first, the gap between social mobilization and economic development. So social mobilization here refers to a change, a series of change, an array of change in attitudes, values, and expectations of people that might be the consequence of this economic growth and development and modernization process. Increased literacy, increased education, increased communication, increased mass media exposure, urbanization, so on and so forth, whereas economic development refers to the growth in total economic activity and output of a society. And yet, when social mobilization increases aspirations and expectations of individuals, and yet economic growth, the rate of economic growth cannot sufficiently satisfy these aspirations and demands, you end up with people feeling increasingly frustrated, right? And an example of this is also, you can observe this in the increasing income inequality of that view in Vietnam. So here is a chapter from our volume by Trịnh Thanh Ly, and here she outlines the gap, the increasing inequality in Vietnam, in which despite the constant increase in minimum wages for workers over the years, the majority of Vietnamese workers are still struggling in order to make ends meet. The consequence of this is very evident. You have cases such as this not too long ago where you have 39 Vietnamese migrants who suffocated and died in basically a tin box after they were smuggled across the channel to Essex looking for new opportunities, right? And you also have other forms of exploitations that intensify social frustration, such as the case of Eco Park, that was at one time dubbed the largest eco-urban center in the North, that prompted recurring protests in Vietnam between 2006 and 2012. The outcome of this social frustration and the outcome of the lack of mobility opportunities for social frustration to be expressed, to be satisfied, to be addressed, is that people become increasingly mobilized. They turn toward politics, right? It galvanizes, it mobilizes individuals and groups into politics. As Huntington put it very nicely and eloquently, social frustration leads to demand on the government and the expansion of political participation to enforce those demands. So in that regard, Ben Kersley has identified 4 prominent waves of such increased political participation in Vietnam, right, between 1995 and 2015, starting with the first period from the mid to late 1990s, where you kind of have just a few, isolated, atomized expressions that are mostly anonymous. And you also have internal communication, expression, limited circulation, lack of coordination. Right? In the second period, you have between 2001 to 2003, there's more activism and also collaboration, more open dissent, where dissidents begin to publish their names, addresses, info, and etc., as well as new online channels. In the third period that Ben Kersley has identified, 2006, you have increased for open political organization, particularly even the emergence of new political parties, such as the Vietnamese Progressive Party, the Vietnamese Democratic Party, right, Bloc A406, so on and so forth, as well as a series of other change. And lastly, in the 4 period, sort of between 2006 to 2015, there is a surge in politically oriented blogs and websites. People discuss Young Long, citizen journals, Young Lan Bao, for instance, Ambassador, The Gossiper, right, Boxit Vietnam, so on and so forth. And it seemed as though in 2005, political life in Vietnam was thriving, was vibrant, right? And it seemed to attest to the country expanding and diversifying civil society. You also see this increased political participation that reflect a larger syndrome in Vietnam overall, with a series of protests and demonstrations in Vietnam across issue areas, from anti-China protests, from environmental protests, right, as well as in the realm of political rights and civil rights, such as in the so-called self-nomination movement in 2016, when a diverse group of activists and dissidents entered themselves and sought to challenge the Vietnamese Communist Party by demonstrating what a, quote, democratic election is supposed to look like. And in our volume, our contributors here have also talked about the case of protests that were prompted by an attempt to pass a regulatory bill that would open 3 special economic zones and that would allow for the lease of these areas for up to 99 years. Okay. So finally, what happens next? Right? In the case of such increased political participation, what do you do if there's such increased need to participate in politics that demand for responses, and yet political institutions do not sufficiently accommodate, provide opportunities for these demands? That's when political instability becomes, that's when political instability is evident and pervasive, right? So here, for instance, Huntington described it that as when you have a lack in the development of political institutions behind social and economic change. That's when you have political instability and violence. Or such a situation might also be referred to as, in Huntington's words, political backwardness. Right? And political backwardness in the face of increased political participation and demands, that's when you have political instability, and that's when you have political disorder and violence. Such cases of where the Vietnamese political system has sort of restricted, refused to accommodate calls for increased political participation is not something new. Right? When in this case here, all the way back in 2004, the founders of the Club for Fighting Corruption, the Club for Democracy, was jailed, was sentenced in 2004 to 19 months. More recently, Ambassador was also jailed and sentenced in 2016. And then, most recently, another prominent case in point of the gap between political participation and political institutionalization and how it can lead to political instability and violence is the case of Dong Tam, right? In April 2017, first, when villagers took 38 official and police hostage because to oppose the government land seizure. The class was at first diffused when there seemed to be a receptivity, a responsiveness on the part of the Vietnamese Communist Party and authorities to accommodate a dialogue with Dong Tam villagers. And it was even held up then as a paragon of the government responsiveness. And there was actually a magazine, an article in the Vietnamese Communist Party Mass Mobilization magazine that recognized and praised this effort to dialogue with Dong Tam villagers. And yet, not long after, this descended into violence on the part where you have a raid in the middle of the night, that resulted in the death of Hu Ken, who was the head of the resistance, virtual resistance of Dong Tam against land seizures, as well as several police officers. So what do we draw with this? In conclusion, as I have illustrated here is a process, several developments that accompany this complex change that come with economic growth and development, right? Particularly the gap between economic social mobilization and economic development that lead to increased social frustration. Second, the gap between social frustration and the lack of mobility opportunities that lead to demands for political participation, and yet increased political participation without sufficiently strong political institution that can accommodate this participation can also lead to, lastly and seriously, in very grave manner, political instability and disorder. Right. So I'm going to end the presentation there to allow for questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yu, for your very insightful analysis and comments. I think the topic today is quite broad and it encompasses different subtopics that warrant further discussion, and therefore I expect to receive many questions from the audience. If you have any questions, you are welcome to type them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And please remember to identify yourself by including your name and affiliation, and try to keep your question short and sharp. In order for you to have time to prepare your questions, I would like to pose one question to each of the speakers first. For Anh Thương, you have referred to Vietnam and South Korea in your presentations, but I know that you have done studies on the developmental part of different countries, including China. What do you think are the main factors that explain the different growth pace between Vietnam and China? I think Vietnam and China are rather interesting cases because they share quite similar political structure. So your comments on these questions would be appreciated. The second question goes to Dr. Yu. In your presentation, you mentioned Huntington and perhaps the modernization theory. So in the Vietnamese context, do you think economic development will one day lead to political democratization, as Professor Tương mentioned earlier, is something Vietnam should do? What do you think about this prospect, and why not it will not happen, or will happen? Okay, so first, we'd like to hear your take, Professor Tương.
Oh yes, thank you for that great question. Many scholars have compared China and Vietnam, and they have made given great insights about the problem. So in my opinion, I think China is a lot less the color red, less ideologically committed than Vietnam. China had a big conflict with the Soviet Union. Not unlike Vietnam, in the 80s, Vietnam was still, heavily dependent on the Soviet Union, and China also experienced the Cultural Revolution that kind of, really caused people to be disillusioned about communism and socialism and Mao and so on. So one clear example that I observed, during from the 1990s and on, is that like the universities in China were quickly modernized, westernized as well. In the 1980s, China was an ally of the U.S. and sent thousands of students to the U.S. So when you go to China today, like Chinese universities, the scholars, many of them were trained in the U.S., including leading scholars and administrators and so on. Vietnam, until like maybe 7 years ago, was still dominated by Soviet trained scholars. That's very clear, when you compare the two, university system. So China was less red, It has, more ambitious leaders like Deng Xiaoping and so on. It has a more centralized system that allows it to once certain policies determined, it can mobilize the whole system into action much better. It has a larger domestic economy, able to attract big Western corporations. It was a lot more industrialized than Vietnam on the eve of reform. So China, was actually slower than Vietnam in some important reform measures like price liberation, for example. But it caught up and it grew a lot faster than Vietnam eventually. That's my answer.
Okay, thank you. So basically, they are better at executing policy, right? And you, what do you think about my?
Yeah,
I think this is also the question from Dương Nguyen. How do you think Vietnam can liberalize its political institutions?
yeah. I mean, so first of all, thank you so much for the question. But even before that, I thought it was quite interesting that to observe that China was less red than Vietnam, right? Whereas the maybe assumption, at least at the surface, would be that China would be the opposite, precisely because China underwent the Cultural Revolution and underwent rectification to a deeper degree and penetrated in a deeper degree than Vietnam was ever able to achieve. So I thought that was quite a different challenge, the conventional account of Vietnam and China. And the question about democracy, of course, one thing to notice during my entire presentation and discussion of Huntington, I never even mentioned the word democracy. That is intentional, because what the Huntingtonian framework differs from modernization theory in very important ways. And modernization theory states that countries would transition from traditional, primitive society to sort of becoming more modern, more industrialized, and this is going to bring about change in values and attitudes, and that will ultimately lead to democracy. Democracy is seen as the end of this teleological process. From what we know, and when we look at numerous cases, including Vietnam, that is simply not the case. There's no deterministic, at least in my view, many cases, even outside of the case of Vietnam and China, there's no deterministic kind of relationship between economic growth and democratization. Rather, what this means is, in Huntington theoretical formulation, regime type, right, is not a predictor of change. It's not a consequential deterministic outcome of the process of modernization and economic growth. So what matters instead is, will accommodating and being responsive to social grievances and demand necessitate democratization? In other words, does the need to accommodate demands for political participation require political institutions to liberalize and become democratic? And if so, what kind of democratization would ensure such responsiveness? What kind of democratization would ensure that not just democracy for the sake of democracy, but democracy that actually matter in substantive ways? So rather than, I think, asking whether or not Vietnam would democratize, I would shift the focus instead to a more substantive concern of how Vietnam existing political institution can either be more institutionalized, more technocratic, more meritocratic, right, more differentiated in the way that Huntington talked about the idea of institutionalization. So to be responsive in those manners is systematically rather than repressive to the rising and wider demand of society. Yeah, okay. That's my thought.
Okay, thanks. So I think we can follow up on this question with a question from my colleague Phan Xuân Dung, who also has some questions about the issue that we have just mentioned, political participation. He asked, can you discuss the developments of political participation in Vietnam since 2015? And can you elaborate on the VCP's response to increased political participation? For example, are there movements that the party accommodates more than others, or how the party has responded to growing online political participation?
Thank you for that question. So there are the other parts of the presentation that I did not have time to get to addresses this very question, is how in turn has the Vietnamese party and state responded to all these movements and increased political participation, right? And the state, the party have been both repressive as well as responsive, but it has done so in very different ways and in different degrees. In terms of being responsive, in meaning that it has taken steps to actually accommodate, right, incorporate citizens' demand and wishes. You can think of the revision of the land law in 2013 that sought to respond to land conflicts and sort of narrow the scope of arbitrary, indiscriminate land expropriation. You can think of the case of the revision of the labor law in 2019 that now allow for independent trade unions, which China does not. However, as our contributor in the volume also points out, in terms of the revision in the labor law, there's still limitation. There's still a limitation to this responsiveness, and the same with the land law, right? And henceforth, currently right now, Vietnam's in the process of revising its land law, and there's still remaining issues. And the cases like Dam Tam attest to the limitations of previous attempt to be responsive. So in other words, the responsiveness should go further in the direction of institutionalization. And then in terms of repression, you see Vietnam also being responsive. Repressive, meaning use force, crackdown, and in terms of, but it has done so with some restraint in terms of its use of law and formal channels, such as the law of association, right? If the law of association had been passed when it was proposed, it would have been a draconian law that would have been focused more on function of social control rather than a law that would enable and strengthen citizen rights. Same with the case of law of protest. So the delay of those laws, actually, I would argue, is provides some good indicator of restraint of the kind of competition, contestation, the significance of civil society in Vietnam that can sort of push back and call for restraint on the part of the state in terms of repression. But you do have cases like the cybersecurity law, and also now after 2016 in particular, a trend of increased repression that actually become more systematic. And that's why I argue in my implication that should not be the direction. That should not be the direction that Vietnam should pursue. And there's been conversation that the cybersecurity law, that Vietnam adopts, very much kind of mirror China's own version of such a law, right? And that should not be the model to follow.
Okay, thank you for your comments. I think before we move on to other topics, there's another question from Natasha Hamilton-Hart, directed to Professor De Vu, who also addressed this issue of democratization and political participation. They ask a question on likely trajectories of change given the nature of state and party institutions. Does the Vietnamese state, have the institutional backbone to become more Weberian if it did privatize and liberalize as you suggest, or would it simply become a captured political economy? What do you think?
The key, great question. I think the key is to follow a particular sequence by reforming the bureaucracy first. The bureaucracy is strong. The state is currently, has a lot of power. So it should reform the bureaucracy first. To create a Weberian bureaucracy first before it liberalize, the economy and society, for example, so that the bureaucracy can stay in control of the subsequent changes.
Okay, thank you. So now we can go deeper into some aspects of your presentations. First question from Vadim Atnashev. In 2022, the size of Vietnam's informal economy is estimated to be 20.5%. which represents approximately 315 billion at GDP PPP levels. Could you comment, please, Anh Tường. Perhaps they mean that Vietnam's GDP is actually bigger than what is reported in official statistics.
Right, but we don't have any much, knowledge about that informal economy. That's a problem. So my analysis is based, as like other analysts as well. I mean, based on official data, so we just need future studies of the informal economy. But it's huge. Everyone acknowledges that it's huge.
Okay, and I think recently Vietnam actually has revised its GDP about 20% up to perhaps to take into consideration some of the contribution of the informal sector. Next question from Nguyen Khắc Giang, who is a visiting fellow with us at VSP. First, to Dr. Như, as urbanization in Vietnam continues to accelerate, what are the prospects of the relationship between farmers and the state in the coming decades? And the next question for Anh Tường, what are the key differences between the Vietnamese and Chinese versions of red capitalism? You have mentioned about the political system and the overall performance of the country, but you mentioned also red crony capitalism. And do you observe the same thing in China? And what are the differences between the two? Thank you. And you first, please.
Well, I think rather than predicting what the relationship between farmers and the state will be in the coming decades, I think we can look at what the relationship has been so far, right? And so far as the kind of examples that I've shown is the relationship has not one that necessarily benefited villagers and farmers in the way that it should. Rather, villagers and farmers, despite the fact that the so-called, peasantry, the peasant class, traditionally, historically, were the constituency, so to say, of the Vietnamese Communist Party historically. And yet, in this process of urbanization, often farmers, villagers become the victims, in which, agricultural land. Agricultural rural land is the largest land type that's been expropriated and seized for the purpose, precisely the purpose of urbanization, economic development, and so on and so forth. And you have yet, rate of compensation are not equal to market rate. You name it, right? The case of Dom Tam is a case in point right there in terms of the kind of relationship, the tension, the point of tension of this relationship and where the relationship is at the moment. And that should be changed.
Thank you.
To Zhang's question, I think the Chinese economy is more diversified. It's less open and it's more developed technologically. And the three things together mean that it's more resilient, it's stronger, it's less vulnerable to shocks in the global market economy, for example.
Thank you. Just another question related to China from Pierre Martin, working at the French embassy in China. It is to Professor Tường. You mentioned the Communist Party of Vietnam's control over the private sector. What are the instruments that the party uses to ensure its control, and are they effective? Do you have any insights on this?
Again, there's still kind of very little knowledge of these issues, but the party just does not. Makes it very difficult for private companies to acquire land, even to obtain licenses for a time. Like until recently, it was difficult for them to obtain licenses. They have to pay exorbitant fees to various local officials just to register their company. Like during daily management of their businesses, a lot of taxes and other extortions. And they have no way to go to complain. I mean, they just kind of at a very disadvantaged, and like they don't have access to state capital. They have to pay rents to state land and so on. Like so many other restrictions on their activities compared to the state sector. And that's why the sector is quite fragmented, even though it accounts for 50% of the economy or 40%. 98% of companies are small or very small in scale, meaning, like they maybe have less than 10 workers, for example. So that's the current situation with the private sector in Vietnam.
Okay, thank you, Anh Thương. Next question goes to Dr. Nhu. It's quite a long question, but basically they are asking, I think it's from Sơn Chen. He's a journalist who has participated in both criticizing government activities and fighting against harmful anti-government rhetoric. They ask, is there a possible solution to improve the quality of civil engagement in political activities? And I think this is a relevant question given the recent trend in which the Communist Party of Vietnam seems to adopt a heavy-handed approach to civil society, and the civic space is closing in Vietnam. What do you think about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, so thank you for asking that question. It's an important question, especially as you mentioned here in the current kind of changing climate, right? I mean, what this really calls for is speaks to the agency of and the innovation of political, what is activists or civil societies, right, or sort of individuals more generally, of finding different ways to navigate, to circumvent, right, these new restrictions, new repressive kind of measures that intend to limit such space, to contract the civil society space in Vietnam. And we know for a fact that that's possible. Even in the case of the 2016 self-nomination movement, is a case in which individual also circumvented, right? So use social media as a means to circumvent restrictions on the part of the state to make a point, right? And so the current restriction in Vietnam, it certainly has an impact on civil society currently, but that doesn't mean that activists in Vietnam do not exercise any kind of agency or are not trying to find a way to circumvent that.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have two questions for Professor Thương about foreign investment in Vietnam from Ray Hao Pua. First, Vietnam is attracting a lot of FDI, but how is this promising country to, how is this helping the country to avoid the middle income trap and move up the value-added manufacturing of value-added chain? And the next question is, why is most manufacturing or FDI concentrated in the northern area, Hanoi and neighboring provinces, rather than Ho Chi Minh City? Proximity to China for supply chain, is it a factor, or ports like Hai Phong, connectivity, is it a factor, or do we see other major industrial areas developing in the next 5 to 10 years? Thank you.
Great questions. First question about whether Vietnam, or how can Vietnam avoid middle income trap. I wish I knew the answer. I don't know. The current political system doesn't give me much hope that Vietnam would ever get out of that. Second question, it's true that there has been more manufacturing FDI coming in the northern area. And the reasons you mentioned are true. And also there are other reasons like higher wages in the south, because it has been developed much earlier, so it's the wages there, wage level are a bit higher, and also like the shortage of workers maybe contributed to it, and also the more investment in upgrading infrastructure in the north in the last decade or so compared to the south. So the roads and the ports of the south have suffered from lack of investment, whereas like the government investment has concentrated in the north.
Okay, thank you. I think I can add a little bit more to this question. I mean, yeah, you're right that in the north, a lot of foreign invested projects, especially in the electronic sector. But my observation is that currently there's also more investors looking to invest in the south. There are already a lot of industrial parks in the south, but I mean, recent trends, I mean, foreign investors tend to invest in the north because of proximity to China, but exactly because of that, land price in the north is increasing. And actually, I've been told that many investors cannot secure land in northern industrial parks, and they have to move to the south. So I think in the medium term, there will be more balance between the two regions in terms of attracting new foreign investment. The next question goes to you from David Brown. You mentioned, you implied that 2016 was a turning point and that the failure of the system to accommodate growing political participation in the years since have created conditions that nurture political instability. And yet, if anything, there is less protest. Could this mean that a party seen as aggressively pursuing corruption and backsliding still benefits greatly from performance legitimacy? What do you think?
Yeah, so whether or not there's in fact less protest, that's something that I would be interested in also knowing. And how can we know that for a fact? I mean, I study land, and I do know that in terms of land partition, I mean, because of Vietnam revision of 2013 land law, there is evidence that the rate of partition has gone down. At the same time, you still have cases like Dong Tam, which are still quite significant, and you still have cases like the expropriation of, land in the Lop Hung Garden in Ho Chi Minh City. So clearly, maybe there is less protest, but there's still unaddressed demands, sort of grievances, right? And then the other part of the question about performance legitimacy, I mean, so I agree in part that I also agree that Vietnam does have some claim to performance legitimacy, but it is not merely contingent on its ability to cultivate economic growth. It's also contingent on its ability to address other problems that arise as a consequence of the pursuit of economic growth at all costs. Right. And so Vietnam has shown some responsiveness, and in some cases, I argue in land, in labor, it has shown, high degree of institutionalization in terms of those responsiveness. But as I also highlighted, there's still limitation. There's still limitation to such responsiveness. And so, I mean, this relates to another question, I think, in the Q&A about legitimacy, right? Whether or not in the protests that I have talked about, people are just protesting, sort of voicing their substantive grievances, or people are really challenging the legitimacy of the political regime. I mean, that is really the puzzle here and the question to be addressed. And to be honest, I'm not sure, right? It's hard to tell whether or not, I mean, in the case of Dong Tam, villagers on the one hand claim that they still believe in the party, but the fact that the party then reneged, sort of went against its word later on, that certainly created, that certainly raised questions. Right? That certainly challenged whether or not villagers should continue to believe in the willingness of the party and the commitment of the party to dialogue, to be genuinely responsive to their grievances and demands.
Thank you, Như. I think we have almost run out of time, and because now it's quite late in the US, I would like to end our session on time, but I think we can try to answer two more questions, one for each speaker. First, for Professor Thiong from Kok Fei Chin, taking heed of China's recent Xi Jinping's reversal of Deng Xiaoping's political and economic reform, do you think it is politically feasible to undertake the reform you recommended, especially professionalize the state bureaucracy and liberalize a society?
Well, great question. I don't know either. So, but I can guess that it's feasible if, it's politics is an act. right? And Nguyễn Phú Trọng shows that he could do the impossible, right? He could have done the impossible by prosecuting like another Politburo member. So it's possible, but it needs, leadership, and whether there's, some leaders who could stand up to the job, it's hard to say. Like right now, it doesn't seem to have anyone, but I don't know if there may be one.
My personal view, I think between the two, professionalizing the bureaucracy is more feasible in the Vietnamese context, but I think it's very difficult. I think the first thing they should do is to increase the salaries for the bureaucrats, because now it's too low. It's almost impossible to attract talents into the bureaucracy and professionalize it. Then the last question for you from Philip Fubui. Huntington, in his book Cultural Matters, has compared Ghana and South Korea, in which he argues that the culture really helped the development of a country. In the case of Vietnam, do you think culture or the way people view things or the work habit also matters in developing the country? I think this is a very relevant question, because developing the country is not only the task of the party, but also the task of every single citizen of Vietnam. And I think how we view the world, how we work, how our work ethic is also important. So what do you think about this?
So this is actually where I depart and disagree with Huntington. On the contrary, I certainly don't deny the culture and ideational factor and ideological factors do matter, right? Those certainly do matter. But in the case of achieving economic growth and economic development, I mean, what has really made the difference and what can make the difference and will make the difference is not merely sort of just dependence on culture, or that Vietnamese work harder than XYZ, right? But rather it requires structural, fundamental, deep structural institutional reform, the kind of deep structural reform that Tung, for instance, talked about. Right, it has to do with the bureaucracy, the apparatus, the whole political apparatus that can really advance, promote, foster economic growth, and also address and allow Vietnam to fully realize development potential, not reliance on cultural factors.
Thank you. There are a few more questions, but I'm sorry we cannot address them all because of the time limit. So if you are interested, you can contact the speakers directly for further discussion. On that note, I would like to end our webinar here. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Tương Vu and Dr. Như Trương for their great presentations and for taking time to provide detailed answers to our attendees' questions. I would like to thank also everyone for tuning in today and for posing great questions to our speakers. Next month, on the 18th of April, we will host another webinar to discuss the recent leadership changes in Vietnam and their implications. If you are interested, please remember to register for it. Once again, thank you very much. Have a nice weekend ahead, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hill. Thanks, everyone.